Welcome to a new episode of Duo Discourse. Today we're doing a deep dive into a subject that is, well, vast and often misunderstood: Islam. We want to look at it not just as a faith, but as a sweeping historical force.
And as an intricate intellectual tradition, one that really completely reconfigured the medieval world.
Exactly. Our mission here is to trace the moral and social path of this civilization. We're going to look at how Islam emerged from this, very fragmented world of 7th century Arabia.
And what principles allowed it to evolve so quickly into one of the world's great empires and, just as importantly, a global center of learning.
Okay, so let's unpack that. To really get the scale of the revolution, we have to set the scene. What was pre-Islamic Arabia, often called the period of Jahiliyyah, actually like?
It was a deeply, deeply challenging environment. The dominant structure was pure tribalism.
Based purely on kinship, right? Not on any kind of shared state or identity.
Precisely. There was no centralized authority. So the law of the land was often just this continuous cycle of vengeance, diyar or blood feud.
Which means conflict was basically constant, unavoidable.
It was. And that violence was compounded by, frankly, crushing economic inequality, especially in the big city centers.
Right. Let's talk about Mecca. It was this huge center for caravan trade organized around the Kaaba, but the wealth was not evenly distributed.
Not at all. It was controlled by a very small, elite merchant class. And what made the oppression so severe was the system of lending. The sources suggest this class charged truly exorbitant rates of usury.
How high are we talking?
Sometimes 200, maybe even 400% interest on a loan.
Wow. So most people were trapped, perpetually in debt, economically enslaved to this tiny group.
Exactly. The whole socioeconomic context was just ripe for a movement that challenged those power structures.
And that harshness extended to the social structures too, didn't it? Particularly for women.
Oh, absolutely. The position of women was abysmal. It really reflected the militaristic nature of the society.
Yeah.
For the most part, they were considered property.
So no agency in their own lives.
Very little. Legally, they had no right to initiate a divorce, no right to inheritance whatsoever. That was all reserved for men who could fight. And their testimony, wasn't typically accepted in any legal proceeding.
And there was the practice of female infanticide.
Yes, tragically.
Yeah.
Sometimes it was a brutal economic calculation, fearing you couldn't afford to raise a daughter. Other times it was a fear of shame or capture by a rival tribe, which would bring dishonor.
So this highly fragmented, violent, unequal world is what the Prophet Muhammad enters when he begins receiving revelations around 610 CE.
It is. And his message immediately takes aim at the two main pillars of that old order: the political power structure and the economy.
How so?
Well, the core message was twofold. First, an uncompromising call for strict monotheism, tawhid, the absolute oneness of God. This directly challenged the polytheism that had made Mecca an economic center.
Because the Kaaba housed all those idols, right? Something like 360 of them?
Over 360, yes. Idols like Hubal and Alat. So that was one challenge. The second, and just as revolutionary, was the message of social justice, an outright condemnation of usury and a call to protect the poor.
But just having an idea, no matter how powerful, isn't enough to survive when you're threatening the elites. The real turning point was the Hijra.
The migration, yes. From Mecca to what became Medina in 622 CE. That event was fundamental. It was a political act.
What do you mean by that?
It moved the early Muslim community away from the dominance of kinship and tribe and established the Ummah.
A single, unified community.
The unified community where allegiance was based on shared faith, not bloodline. And that new structure is what gave the Arabs the organizational dynamism to transcend their old warring ways and become a transformative force.
So the Ummah gives them unity. But what about the ideas that bind them together? Let's get into the metaphysical framework that dismantled the old injustices.
If Tawhid is the foundation, then the structure of the faith is really articulated through the 6 articles of faith. These beliefs provide the deep moral and ethical context for a Muslim's life.
We mentioned Tawhid, the oneness of God. What else defines this worldview?
Well, first is the belief in angels, beings created from light who were entirely obedient to God. Jibril, or Gabriel, for instance, who delivered the revelation.
Okay.
Second, a belief in revealed books. This acknowledges earlier scriptures like the Torah, the Psalms, and the Gospel. The Quran, though, is understood as the final, complete, and pristine Word of God.
And the third article is about the prophets?
Yes, this long chain of messengers sent throughout history, from Adam all the way to Jesus, with Muhammad being recognized as the seal, or the final messenger, completing that Abrahamic tradition.
And for the individual believer, Personal accountability seems to be the thread that ties all of this together.
That's the fourth article. Belief in the day of judgment. The core concept is that this life is a test, and every individual faces ultimate personal accountability for their actions. You can see how vital that was in challenging the Meccan power structure. If the next life is the true measure of worth, then earthly wealth and tribal status suddenly become meaningless.
The last two articles are probably the ones that get debated the most, philosophically.
They are. There's the belief in divine decree, or al-Qadar, and then the balancing element of human free will.
Right. So the understanding is that God has total prior knowledge. Everything is part of a divine plan. But if God knows everything, where does our choice come in? Doesn't that lead to determinism?
That is the philosophical challenge, and the tradition navigates it carefully. The consensus among scholars is that while God knows the outcomes, he has still given humanity the conscious ability to choose between good and bad.
So knowledge isn't the same as compulsion.
Exactly. That choice is what makes us moral agents, what makes us deserving of reward or punishment.
And this whole metaphysical framework is then supported by the 5 pillars, the rituals.
Right. The obligations that move faith from the internal spiritual realm directly into the social sphere.
We have the declaration of faith, the shahada, the 5 daily prayers, salah, fasting during Ramadan, Psalm, the pilgrimage or Hajj.
And, crucially, zakat, the obligatory almsgiving or charity. This is so important because the pillars aren't just spiritual exercises. They demand social responsibility. Zakat, for instance, is a legal mechanism for wealth redistribution. It directly counters the exact economic oppression of the Jahiliyyah period.
So let's talk about the practical application of this moral revolution. How did these principles translate into tangible legal changes that actually dismantled the injustices women were facing?
As a profound transformation. Morally and legally, the condemnation of female infanticide was explicit, which was a clear public stance against it. Theologically, Islam elevated women from being treated like commodities to having inherent worth and dignity before God.
That's a huge philosophical shift. But what about the concrete legal rights, the things that weren't there before?
The change in property and inheritance law was, arguably, the most radical break from that old system. Before Islam, only adult males who could fight were allowed to inherit property.
And Islam changed that.
It introduced specific, legally enshrined inheritance rights for women, for daughters, wives, mothers. It affirmed their right to economic autonomy and property ownership. I mean, this was truly revolutionary for 7th century Arabia.
And what about marriage and divorce? You said women had no agency there before.
That changed too. The legal framework gave women mechanisms to end marriages, which was unheard of. The introduction of khulu allowed for a wife-initiated divorce.
How did that work?
Typically by returning the dowry. But the point is, it gave women a clear legal path to exit a bad relationship. And beyond that, the unlimited polygamy that existed was drastically restricted.
It wasn't abolished, but it was curtailed.
Heavily curtailed. Islam imposed strict provisions requiring fairness and equality among wives, and it limited the number to 4. That was a massive legal rollback of the pre-existing custom.
So this wasn't just moral guidance. It was a complete rewriting of family and property law that pushed back hard against the injustices, not just in Arabia, but in many other ancient societies at the time.
That's the key historical context. The reforms were a radical mitigation of existing oppression. Islam provided legal, spiritual, and economic recognition for women that was a severe departure from the norms of the time.
Let's move to the source material itself. Islamic law and morality come from 2 sources, right? The Quran, as God's direct word, and the Sunnah. Can you define the Sunnah and the Hadith for us?
Of course. The Sunnah is the exemplary conduct of the Prophet Muhammad, his custom, his way of life. The Hadith are the narrations, the specific sayings, actions, and even his silent approvals that embody that Sunnah.
And together they form the basis for law, alongside the Quran.
They are essential legislative and moral sources, yes.
Okay, but these Hadith were passed down for generations, often orally at first. How did scholars make sure they were authentic? Because the way they verified their sources is, frankly, revolutionary.
It's one of the greatest intellectual achievements of that early civilization. It shows a profound scholarly commitment to reliability. Scholars developed this incredibly sophisticated methodology to authenticate hadith, and it was based on 2 main parts.
What were they?
First, the isnad. That's the meticulous chain of narrators who reported the text. It's like checking the references on a dissertation, but taken to an incredible extreme. Scholars would spend lifetimes assessing the trustworthiness, the piety, the memory, even the physical likelihood that the people in the chain could have actually met.
It sounds like academic peer review, but on a massive scale, ensuring the chain of custody was sound before you even look at the content.
That's a perfect way to put it. And the second part is the content. The matnan, the actual text of the saying or action. Based on that rigorous assessment of the isnad, hadiths were then classified as authentic, good, weak, or, fabricated. This intellectual rigor was absolutely central to defining the Islamic sciences.
Now, after the Prophet's death in 632 CE, the political trajectory changes very quickly. We see this rapid expansion, but also the major political division that still defines the Muslim world today, the Sunni-Shia split.
hmm And that schism right after his death was purely political. It was about the question of succession, of the caliphate. The majority, who became known as Sunnis, favored election or consensus by the community. That led to Abu Bakr becoming the first caliph.
And the minority?
Minority, the Shias, believed leadership should come from the Prophet's family line, and they favored Ali.
So despite this deep political disagreement, the core tenets, the Tawhid, the Quran, the five pillars, are shared by both groups.
Absolutely. The dispute is fundamentally about who holds legitimate political and religious authority. And despite that internal division, the unified Ummah expanded incredibly fast under the early caliphs, conquering huge parts of the Byzantine and Sassanid empires.
Which leads us directly into what we call the Islamic Golden Age, centered in Baghdad under the Abbasids, starting around the 8th century.
It does, and this flourishing of learning is often tied back to something called the translation movement.
What made that movement so revolutionary?
Well, what's fascinating is the sheer breadth and the non-sectarian nature of it. The Abbasids actively fostered the collection and translation of classical knowledge, Greek, Persian, Indian, into Arabic. This was institutionalized in places like the House of Wisdom in Baghdad.
And the sources show this wasn't just Muslims translating these texts.
No, not at all. The effort was frequently led by non-Muslim scholars like the famous Christian physician Hunayn ibn Ishaq. It shows this incredible degree of intellectual collaboration. They were just hungry for knowledge wherever it came from.
And this explosion of knowledge wasn't just kept in royal libraries. It was democratized by a huge technology transfer.
Paper. The introduction of paper technology from China in the 8th century was transformative. Before that, you had expensive scrolls. Paper made writing, copying, and selling books possible on a mass scale centuries before that happened in Europe.
You can just imagine the intellectual shift. Suddenly, knowledge could be spread widely.
And it fostered an environment where huge scientific breakthroughs happened.
So what are some of the standouts, the aha moments from that era?
In mathematics, you can't overstate the importance of Al-Khwarizmi. He's rightly called the father of algebra. The word itself comes from his book title, Al-Jab. The word algorithm is just a version of his name. His work fundamentally changed global mathematics.
And in medicine, they weren't just preserving old texts, they were building on them.
And critiquing them. Raises, for example, heavily criticized some of Galen's ancient Greek theories that were, frankly, flawed. And they specialized. Al-Zarawi became the father of surgery, developing tools you'd still recognize today. And Ibn Zura gave clinical proof that scabies is caused by a mite, which completely broke with the old theory of humorism that had dominated medicine for centuries.
Moving from science to governance, the legal framework is known as Sharia. What did this framework say about managing a vast, pluralistic civilization with so many different faiths?
The foundational principle is stated very plainly in the Quran. There is no compulsion in religion. That sets the standard. Belief must come from personal conviction. So Islamic jurisprudence developed the concept of dhimmis, or protected people.
This referred mainly to Jews and Christians.
Primarily monotheists, yes. It was all al-Kitab, or people of the book.
And what did that protection actually mean for their daily lives?
It was a contract. They were allowed to practice their religion, maintain their own courts for personal matters like marriage, and their life, property, and places of worship were protected by the state. In exchange, they paid a tax, the jizya, which exempted them from the military service required of Muslims. It created a really effective structure for religious pluralism.
Let's quickly touch on a couple of common misconceptions. It's easy for people today to look back at the status of women and misunderstand the context.
The historical reality is that the reforms Islam introduced were a radical mitigation of existing, severe patriarchal injustices that were common across the ancient world. Islam did not introduce patriarchy. It countered the deep economic and legal powerlessness women faced by granting them rights that were unheard of in that region.
And what about tolerance? The reality of the dhimmis was probably more complex than a simple definition.
Of course. Historical reality always is. While some restrictions or episodes of persecution certainly existed under specific rulers, like Caliph al-Mutawakil's dress codes, the practical reality was often flexible and cooperative. Non-Muslims were critical to the state. They held prestigious jobs in finance and medicine. They lived in the same neighborhoods. Historically, they often enjoyed better religious freedom and social standing than their Jewish or Muslim contemporaries did in parts of Europe during that same time.
So if we connect this incredible arc from a fragmented tribal society to a global multi-faith empire, what does this all mean for the broader global picture?
It means the Islamic intellectual tradition was instrumental in shaping the very foundation of Western thought.
How so?
Think of scholars like Avicenna ibn Sina and Averroes ibn Rushd. They preserved, they analyzed, and they synthesized the entire body of Greek classical philosophy, especially Aristotle, whose works have been largely lost in the West during the Dark Ages.
So it was through Arabic translations that Aristotle was reintroduced to Europe.
Yes, through Arabic translations and commentaries, which were then translated into Latin in places like Spain. This intellectual flow fundamentally influenced medieval scholasticism and the rise of European universities. The Islamic Golden Age literally saved antiquity and ensured the continuity of global knowledge.
So the final thought for our listeners to mull over
Is that this massive transfer of philosophy and science linking the classical world to the Renaissance is perhaps the most profound and often unacknowledged legacy of this entire civilization. It shows just how interconnected our intellectual history really is.